So welcome to the second panel of today's webinar, which is jointly organized by the Academy of International Business and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. My name is Ari Van Esch, and I will be hosting today's panel. So before we start, I would like to thank several people who made this webinar happen. This project is the brainchild of Jeremy Clegg, who is the president of the Academy of International Business, and James Jan, who is senior director at UNCTAD. And they will, at the end of this webinar, talk about the future collaborations that they have in mind between our two organizations. Amelia Santos Paulino from UNCTAD was my chief ally in organizing this webinar, and I'm profoundly grateful for her to do that. And finally, Tunga Kiak, who is the executive director of the Academy of International Business, and his team took care of all the logistics. And they did this from the United States, which meant that I actually started working at 4 o'clock this morning. So the topic of this webinar is very important. As a growing portion of the global population is being vaccinated, we are starting to see light at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic tunnel. Governments, therefore, have the opportunity to put in place policies that not only stimulate an economic recovery, but also build back a better and more sustainable global economy. The question we asked this morning and also in this webinar is what governments' priorities should be in terms of international business policy. So I'm delighted to have an exciting and stimulating panel of leading scholars in international business and in international development to try and answer this question here today. So in order of their appearance, we are joined by, first of all, Kunal Sen, who is director of the United Nations Institute for Development Economics Research, which is located in Finland. And he's also professor of development economics at the University of Manchester. Second, we're joined by Helena Barnard, who is full professor at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So until recently, Helena was vice president of administration on the executive board of the Academy of International Business, and she's also area editor at the Journal of International Business Policy. Our third speaker is Lorraine Eden, who is Professor Emerita of Management and Research Professor of Law at Texas A&M University in the United States. She has been editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Business Studies in the past. She has also been president of the Academy of International Business, and currently she is dean of the AIB Fellows. Our fourth speaker is Ram Mudambi, who is a Frank M. Speakman Professor of Strategy at the Fox School of Business of Temple University in the United States. In addition to being a fellow of the Academy of International Business, he is also area editor of the Journal of International Business Policy, among many other editorial roles that he is currently filling. In addition to the panelists, we're also joined by 2 discussants. The first discussant is Amelia Santos Paulino, who is chief of the Investment Research Section at UNCTAD's Division on Investment and Enterprise, and she is also deputy editor of the Transnational Corporations Journal. And the second discussant is Maria Teresa Fleury, who is full professor of international management at both Fundação Getúlio Vargas and the University of Sao Paulo. An AIB fellow, She was, until recently, Vice President Program on the Executive Board of the Academy of International Business. So you can see here that we've got a lot of panelists, a lot of discussants. So therefore, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first panelist, Kumal Sen, to the microphone, who will be talking about a research agenda from a development economics perspective. So Kunal, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Ari, and thanks very much to the Academy of International Business and UNCTAD for inviting me in this very distinguished panel on a very relevant set of topics. So what I'll be speaking about is, I'm an economist, and I'll be speaking mostly from an economics point of view, and I'll also speak in particular about the global value chain issue that was raised in the concept note for this particular panel. So let me start by saying that the thing that we know right now, and what we know right now, is quite fragmented, mostly from case studies, quite anecdotal. But what we do know is that the pandemic was both a demand shock and a supply shock. And as a consequence, we have seen through the last year or so that this demand and supply shocks have had quite strong magnified effects. And we also seen that the direct suppliers and buyers have been especially badly hit, while it's been less obvious that those who are indirectly involved in the global value chains have been as badly hit. It seems the effect has been mostly strongest felt among direct suppliers and buyers. We also know that some industries and some workers have been particularly badly hit. For example, women workers in the ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh. So we know that there's been this asymmetrical effects that are both industry-specific and also worker-specific. And as a consequence, we are seeing heterogeneous effects of the pandemic on formal versus informal workers, skilled versus unskilled workers, by gender, income status, and in fact, in many other dimensions. So for example, we know that informal workers have been very badly hit, in part because the kind of work they do needs them to go out and work. And with the great lockdown that happened last year, and it's happening in Europe now, many of these workers are not able to go to work. Formal workers can work from home, remote work, and they've been not as badly affected. For the same reason, we seem to see that unskilled workers have been also particularly adversely affected by the pandemic, skilled workers less so. And we also find quite compelling evidence from the work that we have done in UNE wider that women workers have been particularly badly hit, especially because women tend to be mostly self-employed in developing countries, low-income countries, and the self-employed have also been affected because they couldn't go out and work as much. And so we have this sorts of, as I said, more fragmented evidence. So for example, if you were looking at specific sectors and industries, countries, we get this sort of case study evidence that is coming in. For example, work the bank has been doing, or the World Bank has been doing in Vietnam, electronics value chains have been impacted by lockdowns of overseas suppliers and disruption of logistics services affecting both shipping of raw materials and electronic components and delivery of final products to consumers. One case study from a country which has been very much involved in global value chains in electronics. A second case study comes from Bangladesh, the ready-made garment sector, which is by far the most important sector in Bangladesh. And also Bangladesh has been very deeply engaged in the value chain in ready-made garments. There we find, and there's this very good study by a set of authors, some based in the University of California, Berkeley, some based in the NGO BRAC in Bangladesh. The ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh has been particularly badly hit as consumer demand for apparel plummeted last year, leading to global retailers, the big retailers that we have, canceling orders and revising their sourcing strategies. And we have very good evidence now from a big sample that has been done by this group of authors on how badly women workers have been especially very badly hit. So that what we know, but what do we need to know? And that's what I want to speak on the next few minutes. So one thing that's quite clear is that we're going to see a new era of telemigration. And that's going to lead to an increasing demand for the globalization of services. Now that's quite interesting because that could actually offer new possibilities for the latecomer in countries who've been so far shut out of trade and manufacturing. So for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, some South Asian countries, some Latin American countries who have not really been able to engage very much in the trade and manufacturing. That's an interesting possibility, which wasn't really possible, which wasn't something that was so obvious in the pre-pandemic period. But at the same time, and there's a very good report that's come out from UNIDO on the Industrial Development Report IDR 2020, which shows that what we find is the advanced digital production technologies, ADP technologies in short, which are the core of the fourth industrial revolution, seem to be concentrated in a few countries in the developing world. And no surprises, mostly East Asia. So the ADP technologies seem to be very much concentrated in few countries which have been very successful anyway in manufacturing in East Asia. Secondly, what do we need to know also is this concern about increased backshoring. Now that was happening even before the pandemic, but there is now a concern that what we might see is a retreat from globalization, and increasingly the countries, the investment countries, for example, we might bring that production back to their own countries, which would mean that the advantages that many developing countries had in labor-intensive manufacturing might not be there. So if that's the case, if we do see this increased backshoring, especially in labor-intensive manufacturing, what does it mean for the potential possibilities for the low-income countries who are still really trying to find their feet in this process of labor-intensive manufacturing? What does it mean for them, especially when they have this compared advantage in unskilled labor, but not in skilled labor? So we don't really know that yet. What does this implicate? If it is the case that backshoring is going to happen, what does it mean for the future of labor-intensive manufacturing and especially export-oriented industrialization? And finally, I also think that there is now this debate that's going on, which I think we need to engage with. That we see clearly now the asymmetries in vaccine supplies, in PPE equipment, and there is now quite a strong view among many developing countries. No, we cannot do this again. We cannot have the situation that we do not have production of vaccines, PPE, what have you, in our own countries. We got to start building up pharmaceutical industries, maybe perhaps for the next pandemic, more manufacturing expertise around health equipment. So what does it mean, therefore, for the future is really a really important question. Are we going to see a retreat from globalization? Are we going to see a move towards greater protection? Are we going to see more self-reliance coming in? Now, this of course cuts both ways. Self-reliance, domestic production, more domestic production is a good thing. And one may argue that what is the unfortunate situation you have with vaccine supplies, if you had more pharmaceutical industries in Africa, for example, we would have averted the problem we're seeing right now, where many African countries might not get to see the vaccines supplied to them till next year. Having said that, I'm a strong believer in globalization having strong positive effects. So how will it benefit the global economy in the long run? We don't know that. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kunal. So I think you've raised very important points how the pandemic might have had a very differential impact on the tangible parts of the global value chains versus the more intangible parts. And I do think this is something we'll be coming back to later on as well. So just for the audience, so we'll be keeping the question and answer period until the end of all the presentations. But if you do have any questions, you can always put it in the question and answer box. And you can even vote which questions you wouldn't want to put on top. Later on, I will be selecting from these questions for the discussion parts. So at this point, I'd actually like to invite Helena to the microphone. So Helena will also be focusing on the impact of the pandemic on developing countries and more specifically on Africa's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ari. Oopsie, I wanted to first just stay there. The title of my talk is The Blessings of Being at the Margin. And in global, in international business, UNCTAD, it's generally assumed that it's not an ideal place to be. But in the case of COVID-19, I really think that there's been a few cases where Africa actually benefited from being not in the center of attention. So I want to talk about 4 factors And then I want to wrap up by just discussing some implications for the future, both in terms of practice and potentially in terms of research. So the first thing that I think is really important to understand is that Africa was not spared from COVID-19. It was the last continent to register a case, and once it was on the continent, it slowly spread because it's globally disconnected and because the continent internally is also not very well developed. But I think a lot can be learned by looking at the fatalities from South Africa, where I'm from, over the past year. So what we can see is that there's 2 surges of COVID, the ones in red, but at the same time, each time there was a surge that was in red that was reported COVID deaths, there was a much steeper surge in total fatalities. And modelers have estimated that between 85 and 95% of the total excess deaths were in fact due to COVID infections. This pattern is even more clear when we look at provincial level data, and basically the better the healthcare system, the smaller the gap between the reported COVID deaths and the actual fatalities that were reported. I have the 2 provinces that are predominantly rural, where it's clear that the fatalities vastly outnumber what was reported in terms of COVID deaths. And then the urban provinces, Gauteng, which has Johannesburg and Pretoria, and the Western Cape, where Cape Town is, where you have far more reporting. I think 3 things can be deduced from this graph. The first one is hardly news, which is the WHO says we are vastly undercounting COVID in developing countries. But in South Africa, it is mandatory to report deaths. In many African countries, there is not mandatory reporting of deaths, which means that not only do we not know how many fatalities there were, we also don't know how many fatalities would have been to be expected, would have been normal. What we can be sure of, and this is borne out by anecdotal conversations with African colleagues, is that Africa was not spared, although it did not devastate the continent. And when the pandemic first hit, the real concern was, what is it going to do to the continent? Will it be left standing? And yes, it is suffering from hunger, suffering from slower development, but the distress is not as deep as expected. I think one explanation is the fact that Africa was never very well integrated in global value chains. So except as a producer of commodities, raw materials, it really was playing a very minor role in GVCs. This is a 2017 network map. South Africa is on the map. If you look bottom right, sort of United States, China, it's India, South Africa, Argentina. It's the only African country that's whatsoever on this map. So it suggests that when global value chains took the hit that it took, African countries were less affected. The other explanation, I think, is the fact that Africans have long understood that necessity is the mother of invention. Management scholars talk about bricolage. In my language, is a boer maak 'n plan. And they tend to be extremely localized solutions to just keep things going. In this case, there was a project initiated by the South African government to produce ventilators. Bottom right is what they look like. And what you can see is literally the process of developing this. In South Africa, because of anti-apartheid boycotts and sanctions, reverse engineering was happening everywhere. And this person used to work in the automotive industry, managed to find a British Second World War ventilator and reverse engineered this. My explanations tend to be South Africa specific, but it happens all over the continent. I have a doctoral student from Zimbabwe who recently was trying to get the productivity of the Zimbabwean manufacturing sector used return on assets, which seems like a reasonable measure. And the numbers he found were extraordinary. It seemed impossible until we realized that there has been no asset investment in Zimbabwe since 2000, when the land grabs took place. And so I asked him, how are things still going? And he explained that there are individuals who basically salvage broken machinery that's been abandoned by closed operators. And this way of making do, these extremely localized solutions happen all over the continent to keep things going at an extremely local level that is below the radar of global organizations. So they keep things going. They don't enhance the global economy, but it means that in South Africa, there were ventilators. Then finally, the African Union is moving towards integration. So once again, Africa didn't quite get the memo that we're supposed to enter an era of deglobalization, and the African Union has really been slowly progressing towards more regional cooperation. The Continental Free Trade Area was supposed to start on the 1st of July last year. It finally came into effect January the 1st this year. The map shows signatories and ratifications of the Free Trade Agreement. There's experimentation with an African Union passport, starting with diplomatic officers and seeing how it goes. A very big thrust is around peacekeeping, silencing the guns. So the African Union has really been working. It's fragile. I don't want to overstate the importance, but what I think is really important is that the COVID pandemic did not stop this cooperation, did not result in a kind of fractious debate like what we're seeing in the EU at the moment, but in fact strengthened the continental response. When the pandemic started, there was testing only in 3 African countries. There was cooperation between the African Center of Disease Control, the various dialogues about various aspects from education, transportation, economic recovery, and also in terms of the actual response, which I think really brings me to some of the key implications that I think would be important to understand. I think the regional response, there's a whole lot of conversation about globalization, and there's not a lot of conversation about the regional dimension. What is very interesting for me about the African response is that regional connectedness is framed as a way to save human lives. Silencing the guns, the African Union passport is seen as a way of mobility saves lives. And the whole COVID response has been framed as a way of making sure we don't lose lives unnecessarily. So there is, for example, procurement via the African Union to get economies of scale. There's an agreement inside the African Union that if you are in a logistically hard to reach country, that the logistics costs would be subsidized by the African Union. And regional economic progress is really seen as an enabler of this humanitarian mission. Now, obviously, if the African Union says we will procure inside the continent as far as possible, we need to make sure that the continent has the technology available to share information. Those kinds of decisions all have very real economic implications. And in fact, there have been some economic discussions and strife. But I think what's really important and a way of framing the discussion around development is to put the economic component of development explicitly as an enabler rather than as the ultimate goal. And I think to close off, this is Professor Karim from South Africa, this kind of understanding of interconnectedness, of the fact that the African response has really been characterized by a concern to make sure that the continent harnesses a common humanity. I don't want to romanticize what is happening. It remains a fragile continent with many turf wars and so, but I do think that that fundamental understanding that when people talk about deglobalization, the argument is often, well, economically we remain linked. So that is seen as the buffer that prevents against full deglobalization, the economic linkages. In the African context, I think it's very interesting that the economic dimension is underemphasized, and the humanity and the saving of lives is the most important topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Helena. So if I take the two first presentations together, one thing I've really gotten from it is that COVID has created very different realities in developing countries and developed countries. And this has had a big impact on what is needed when we're thinking about investing into sustainable recovery. Right now, I'm very happy to ask Lorraine to step to the microphone. So she's going to take a different angle and look at the impact of digitalization on both the social and the economic imperatives. And so it's going to give something to the front that is really discussed a lot in around the globe. So Lorraine, the floor is all yours.
All right, thank you very much. And I just wanted to say welcome to everyone and thank you for including me in this, this very exciting joint venture between UNCTAD and AIB today. I'm here actually to talk about some work that I've done with Nirja Srinivasan at NIRA. It's a paper we have coming out in the Journal of International Business Policy, which we're calling the Going Digitals, Navigating Economic and Social Imperatives in a Post-Pandemic World. The first slide just basically tells you the overall view of the paper, which basically says, or maybe I should back up and say, I'm fortunate to have lived through two technological revolutions now. I was born in the day of mass production. I watched the Japanese firms bring in lean production in the 1980s, and now I'm seeing a fourth technological revolution into what we're now calling Industry 4.0. A few people have the opportunity to live through these kinds of massive technological change. But when there's change like that, the winds of that kind of change really can negatively and positively affect firms. I think of the Japanese multinationals as being the agents of change in the shift from mass to lean production. Now we're seeing the born digitals, what we call the FAMA firms, right? The Facebooks and the Amazons and the Apples, really introducing digital production and digital globalization. So the traditional firms that I grew up with, what we tend to call the bricks and mortars are having to make huge adjustments and investments under Industry 4.0. And that's what Nirja's and my paper is about. They face an enormous economic imperative over the next few years. And the COVID-19 pandemic has simply made the whole situation worse. What it's done is really upgraded the need for very fast digital change by these large multinationals. Given that these firms have to go digital in order to survive as their economic imperative, they're doing it right in the last couple of years before the SDGs are supposed to have been achieved. 2030 is right around the corner, right? The UN's social imperative of leaving no one behind looks like it can't possibly happen, given the huge shortfall in revenues that's happening as a result of COVID-19 that we've already heard Helena talk about and that we've heard Kunal talk about and the implications for that. One of the things that occurred to Nirja and I was maybe the fact that the going digitals have to change provides a window of opportunity where it might be possible, since they got to do the investments anyway, to tune those investments a little bit towards being more attuned into the SDGs. And then we started thinking, how would you need to do that? If you knew that these investments were coming, and you wanted to make them more attuned to these sustainable development goals, what would you need to do to basically tune the investments such that they put a heavier foot in some sense on the societal impact, given that firms are going to focus primarily on the business impact? And that's what the paper is about. So I don't really need to go here, but I'll say it here that we know that Industry 4.0, we got COVID. Our paper was written in response to one that James Jan wrote, which would be the leading paper in this special issue, where he talks about the footprint of multinationals changing in terms of retreating from globalization, reshoring, regionalizing, and replicating shorter value chains. And we heard some discussion about that today. And again, Kumail talking about the garment industry and consumer electronics industries in Vietnam and what's going to happen to those industries here. One of the things we know about the brick and mortar firms is that they were already heavily invested in developing countries. So what's going to happen to them as they digitalize? Are they going to close down the brick and mortar? Are they going to leave it as it is? Or is there some possibility of a hybrid model? So that's what we're talking about in this paper. I'm just showing you the smiley face here that we talk about on value chains and how digitalization has accentuated the smiley face with the real value added being added at the tails of the smile here. And the question is, how do countries get a share of that value added? What do they need to do, both for their value chains and their supply chains? And in the paper, we go through a multiple number of examples of that. And I'll put some up here to show you. The paper talks about the Janus face of digitalization, the positives and the negatives. The negatives, we already heard a bit about this here this morning too, about the problems if you have unskilled labor and you have an excess of unskilled labor, and what do you need to do if most of these jobs are going to be for skilled labor here. So I have some links here when you see the slides that can lead you over to talk about the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, things that Dell Technology is doing. One of the things I think is really kind of interesting is IBM's call for code, which they're doing using Red Hat technologies, inviting computer programmers all over the world to come together to develop new coding that is pro-sustainable development. And this year, the call for code theme is climate change. More of these kinds of initiatives would really improve the kinds of digital technologies and make them more sensitive to the SDGs. McKinsey has 180 case studies of using artificial intelligence that is pro towards the SDGs. And one I also think is fascinating is the World Economic Forum's Global Lighthouse Network. These are early movers in the going digitals, and they're early movers that are paying attention to the triple bottom line, and therefore, again, moving on the SDGs. So I really do think there is a window of opportunity here. Nirja and I do. But to make that happen, in other words, how do you make going digital multinationals actually pay attention here? Most of our paper is about 3 changes we see need to be made. First is changing the CSR function within multinationals. Most of us think of CSR as primarily housed in the marketing department. Sustainability reports are done every year, and it's really a small budget off on the side. If you're really going to change going digital such that they pay attention to the SDGs, the CSR function has to change. It has to become more front and center. It has to have more money spent on it. We talk in the paper about SDG SWAT teams, about creating SWAT teams that will actually provide advice across the global value chains of firms. One thing that becomes very clear is there needs to be a new way to create ROI, return on investment metrics that can be used inside these multinationals to prioritize SDG investments. We also talk about the need for mapping CSR to the SDGs and creating separate wallets for the SDGs so that philanthropic giving is in one bucket of money, diversity and inclusion is in another bucket of money, and the SDGs are in the third bucket. So more wallet, separately measured, tied to this. And then the third one we're proposing is quite different. We're proposing a new coalition between going digital multinationals and the UN. And we think UNCTAD is best organized to do this, and we give a variety of reasons in the paper why we believe this to be the case. We believe modeling it on BIAC. BIAC is the Business Industry Advisory Council to the OECD. It's been around a long time. And basically, it's a partnership between the OECD and multinationals to think about developing various types of OECD policies. We think that could be done at UNCTAD together with a variety of these leading going digital multinationals as a way to, again, put the pedal to the metal here and make movement on the SDGs happen, given that there is this window of opportunity. These brick and mortar firms are digitalizing. It could be for the negative, it could be for the good. We believe that UNCTAD could take a really leading role here and helping by 2030 increase this so that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Lorraine has been referring to a paper that is forthcoming in the Journal of International Business Policy as a part of a special collection about potential collaboration between AIB and UNCTAD. So James Jan, the director of the one of the senior directors of UNCTAD, has written a lead article where he identifies 5 major forces that are influencing global value chains, and where he indicates predictions about what this will imply for global value chains. Lorraine Eden, Karl Sauvant, and Peter Buckley provide commentaries where they indicate how international business research can contribute to this thinking. So thank you very much for that. Now, as we're talking about global value chains, of course, this is another big topic that a lot of people have been talking about in relation to the post-pandemic era. And so the last panelist for today is Ram Udambi, who has done a lot of research on global value chains and also has been doing some forward thinking about what the pandemic might mean for the way global value chains are reshaped. So Ram, I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. I'd like to, first of all, Ari, can you see the screen?
I did, but it's smaller. Yes, perfect. That was great.
Okay, right. So this is, as Lorraine pointed out with her presentation, I'd like to kick off by saying this is joint work with Vittoria Scalera, my colleague at the University of Amsterdam. I'm going to talk about, as Ari said, value creation in global value chains and the effect of the COVID-19 global disruption. And I'm going to try to talk about this, as you see the title, from both managerial and policy perspectives, with an emphasis to a large extent on the managerial side. I'm going to talk essentially about global value chains in terms of their 2 components, being innovation and production, because I think this decomposition will help us understand the effect of the disruption in a much clearer way. But after that, I will go straight into 3 stages, what I'm going to call short-term effects, medium-term effects, and post-disruption effects. And finally, I'll say a few words about the policy responses to COVID-19 that we have seen and suggest the significant suboptimality that has occurred this time around, which hopefully provide us lessons for the future. I was very happy to see the presentations that came before, because I think a lot of my remarks will certainly connect fairly closely to the remarks of Kunal Sen for sure, and also Lorraine Eden. Perhaps I'm obviously Helena is the expert in Africa, and so I'm not going to venture into that territory. Global value chains, as we know, are composed of multiple and diverse activities distributed around the world, but innovation and production remain their 2 pillars. As I pointed out as Ari pointed out, this work of mine going on for well over a decade now, the 2 components can be looked at as 2 layers. And so we have innovation systems, which capture the bulk of the value in global value chains, as I've pointed out from the beginning of my initial paper back in 2008, and production networks, which capture relatively less value, though capture much of the volume of activity that we observe around. Now, the effects of COVID-19 are going to be very different on these two layers of global value chains, because we know that global innovation systems are based to a large extent on people-based connectivity, whereas global production networks, GPNs you might call them, are based much more on goods-based connectivity. And the COVID-19 disruption particularly has affected people far more than goods. So goods movement recovered fairly quickly, but the people movement is recovering far more slowly. What I'm going to point out, therefore, is that since we have been able, I think as Kunal pointed out quite clearly, high knowledge workers have been less affected because they have been able to replace face-to-face connectivity with electronic connectivity, much as we are doing right now. On the other hand, goods-based connectivity was in the short term affected quite drastically, but firms were able to recover from those in the medium term fairly quickly. So basically we had initial effects. All of us, of course, may recall going a year ago now, going to our supermarkets and finding shelves empty of various products that we wanted. But all of us, I think, pretty much would agree that within a few weeks, those shortages disappeared. On the other hand, the same thing, when we look at people-based connectivity, we were able to migrate very quickly. I, for one, certainly was quite surprised by how my own organization, my own university, was able to migrate literally within days to electronic platforms. However, what is masked here is the fact that in the medium term, the effects on innovation are going to be far more severe. Because what we're doing right now, all of us are doing right now, is that we are mining our existing contacts, but we are not making many new contacts. Innovation systems are based on constant recombinations, constant new meetings, serendipitous connections, which happen, we all know, and geographers have written about this, economists have written about this. There are enormous, irreplaceable aspects of face-to-face connectivity. The building of trust, the building of the first meetings, building new connections, these almost never occur in electronic spaces. And therefore, we're going to see, like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, those new connections that would have been made in the last 12 months, 14 months, 18 months, and have never made, we can recapture those. And those affect innovation systems. We're going to see a downsurt of innovation in the next, I predict, in the next 3, 5, 8 years. The operational timeline is going to be essentially stage 1, as I said, short-term, medium-term, and post-pandemic. Immediately, of course, emergency finance, stop the bleeding, value at risk analysis. International business space, we know that airlines, hotels, Airbnb, VRBO, aerospace industries, travel and tourism, all of these industries have been affected most severely. But the strategic timeline has to be that what you're doing immediately, the emergency responses of firms must bear in mind the importance of path dependency. Because what you do right now should be a building block, not a Band-Aid. Because in the medium term, ultimately, you have to bear in mind that there's going to be enhanced systems based on online, offline integration. Innovation systems must develop new means of replacing the extent of face-to-face workspaces, because the post-disruption new normal is going to be based upon one of enhanced online, offline integration. I think Kunal mentioned this as well, and so did Lorraine. So in stage 1, migration to flexible online system, both the supply and demand side of the market may be forced to increase their interactions in virtual space. What you see on this slide, you can skim through it very quickly. I'm not going to read it, but all of us know this is fairly obvious. We've all seen this. Workplaces have gone very much work from home. Customers are increasingly interacting in online spaces. Stage 2, in terms of production, ultimately 2 strategies. Again, I think Kunal and Lorraine mentioned this. The notion of two strategies that are possible for firms. One is location diversification, reducing dependence on each location. The other is backshoring investment in technology. to move operations to low-risk locations without increasing costs, robotics, 3D printing, etc. Which strategy is chosen is going to be very industries dependent. If you have very high location dependence, if you're producing coffee, I'm sorry, you can't do that with 3D printing, not yet anyway. But if you're producing medical devices, you can utilize technology. So in some cases, if you're a coffee firm, you might think of diversifying your sources so that you're not heavily dependent on one location. If you're at a high-tech industry, you might want to think more in investing in technology. Innovation, of course, we need to build more. This is, of course, very challenging. If you ever find a way to do this, let me know. This is something that is a huge challenge, I think, for firms, for all high knowledge enterprises of all kinds. How do we replace that je ne sais quoi face-to-face reality? The new normal, of course, is going to be one where greater competitive pressure on both online and bricks and mortar spaces. We know that in this space, bricks and mortar firms have developed sophisticated capabilities in this emergency period. Firms like Walmart, for example, have become highly sophisticated in terms of their online capabilities, and therefore they're going to come out of this pandemic with both their left and their right hands extremely strong, both their offline, which they already were strong, and their online strong as well. Online firms like Amazon are going to have to respond to this challenge by building some bricks and mortar space. Firms like Amazon, firms like Netflix, these firms are going to face extremely strong international and domestic challenges, but challenges to integrating things like showrooming, web rooming, and so on. The persistence of new models and business processes is going to depend very much upon the extent of criticality of face-to-face operations. The new normal paradox I pointed here is that the things like surgical procedures, for example, which have a high percentage of critical, irreplaceable face-to-face, they're not going to change so much in the post-pandemic. But things which are where face-to-face is not very important, are going to change dramatically. I was in Seattle last week, and as you can see over here, Amazon started off by replacing bookstores. Now Amazon is building bookstores. So this is essentially the new normal that we're going to see. The last point I'm going to mention before I close is that the policy lessons we've drawn here are, again, this is connect very closely to, I think, what Kunal said earlier. The first objective in the COVID pandemic disruption has been save lives and protect those most at risk. Sadly, even in this entirely one-dimensional focus to response to COVID-19 has often failed. Places like New York, for example, have actually not managed to save lives, even though that was the only objective they were going at. In many countries, there's a virtual ignoring of objective 2. Again, Kunal pointed out this incredible increase in inequality. We know that we have now evidence from varieties of sources that this is the largest increase in inequality, both within countries and across countries in history. And this is something that is almost not talked about. It's sort of in the margins of academic discourse. But certainly policymakers are doing very little to address this objective of how do we deal with this increase of inequality. And finally, objective 3 has been almost completely ignored. Preservation of individual liberties has sort of pretty much gone out the window. So ultimately, to conclude, production effects will be short-term. Innovation effects will show up in the next few years. We should be prepared for this. We're going to see negative effects on innovation. Firms that respond to this disruption by developing building blocks will outperform those that put in band-aids. The new normal will not be radically new. I think all speakers so far have said this. Organizational transformations will be accelerated, but things that we're seeing are just going faster, things that are happening anyway. But finally, the last thing I think perhaps in a way the most important thing is that future policy responses must be multidimensional and incorporating all the tools of cost-benefit analysis, because ultimately there are costs and there are benefits in many different spaces of any global disruption. Thank you. How do I stop sharing? Stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ram. I think it was a great way to finish the round of panelists. So the one message I get from all 4 presentations is that we need to be thinking a lot about connectivity and how this matters for our thinking of recovery post-pandemic. So we heard Helena talking about regional versus global connectivity. We heard Lorraine talking about digital connectivity, and we heard both Kunal and Ram talk about the distinction between people-based versus goods-based connectivity. So this was very interesting. We're not done yet with the panel, though, because we now still have two discussants that will be giving their views about the presentations and their own views as well. So I've asked Amelia to talk about the first two papers or presentations, and Maria about the last two. Amelia, I'm going to give you the microphone straight away.
Many thanks, Ari, and many thanks to Kunal, Helena, and the panel for such an exciting set of presentations. And it's a great honor because I'm glad that the last panelists ended up with the issue of inclusion and development, which is, I think, a very important cross-cutting issue in both the international business and the development literatures. So as we saw from Kunal's and from Helena's presentations, the impact of COVID has been heterogeneous across productive sectors, across groups, and they pose very important questions for future research. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start giving some reflections on Kunal's, then I move to Helena, and then I will try to bring together what are the lessons and what key questions the two fields and the fields in between on international development, international business should try to answer, not only for the sake of research, but also to inform policy. To start with Kunal's presentation, he addressed several important questions, which we have been addressing also at UNCTAD, especially in last year's World Investment Report. The first question that he posed was if we are evidencing a retreat from globalization, from global value chain driven globalization. And in relation to this, what has been the impact across the labor market, especially in labor intensive and export oriented industries. And finally, the challenges of digital and technological divide in developing countries. And across all these questions, there is the issue whether the pandemic will accelerate the global value chains shift. As we know, the growth of international trade and the expansion of global value chains over the last 30 years have had remarkable effects on development. And sometimes research is not good at gauging and analyzing those impact on development. We have shown through different reports and through different research outputs that the fragmentation of production and knowledge transfer, which are intrinsic to global value chains, have driven increases in income, productivity, and diversification, as well as market access possibilities for developing countries. But since the global financial crisis, we have also seen that global value chain growth has languished. And then there's come COVID with as an extra shock to the system of international production. So as James mentioned this morning, this has exacerbated the pre-existing trends of protectionism, the trends on Industry 4.0 and sustainability concerns. So this brings us to the issue of the robustness and resilience of global value chains going forward, and to further look at the development implications of these trends. Going more into the business implications, we have seen that the specialization by firms at the different stages of production enhances productivity and efficiency. But also we have seen that firm-to-firm relationships foster technological transfers and access to capital and inputs along the value chain. However, this is not necessarily the case across all sectors and across all developing regions. And this has been evident from today's presentations, and also highlights the importance of the intersection between international business and development, and also to look at more closely at different business models. Before I go into more policy and research questions, I want to go back to Elena's presentations and what we can take away from that, and then merge it with Kunal's takeaway messages. Elena showed very clearly that Africa's response to the COVID pandemic highlighted the challenges of a weak and fragile healthcare systems. Also, she highlighted the importance of strong leadership, collective actions, and in particular, the need for international cooperation, knowledge creation, and financial support. And from here, there are two important issues which we also have addressed at our work at UNCTAD. First is the need to enhance Africa's participation in regional and global value chain, and second, the role of regional integration, especially to overcome existing constraints. In the current context, while some African countries have been somehow spared from the direct health effect of the pandemic, the continent's economy has been significantly hurt by the economic consequences, especially via investment and trade shocks. Hence, the importance of further looking in research at the business and household responses to the COVID-19 crisis in the continent. That is, we need to have more micro research in addition to the macroeconomic evaluation of the pandemic. In relation to this, and there is something that sometimes is missing from the trade and development discourse, is the role that foreign direct investment has in this particular context, and especially in the context of exogenous shock. We have seen in our different reports and research outputs that foreign direct investments, different type of cross-border investments, are a significant source of external finance for many African countries. And more recently, we have shown that the pandemic led to a dynamic decline in foreign direct investment flows to Africa, especially because lockdown implied a slowing existing investment project, and that's something that we are trying to look more closely, and that Jacob this morning alluded to investment projects and investment in sustainable development sectors. And also, not only a slowing investment project, but the prospect of a protracted recession led investors to reassess new projects. So this is a particular angle that we are trying to bring to our analysis and to our research. So basically, what the message here is the importance of continuing exploring investment in sustainable development sectors as we move towards as Lorraine said, to the achievement, to the finishing line of the 2030 development agenda, but also to the recovery phase post-COVID. So here the message is we should continue to explore the context of investment on SDG sectors. The other issue that Elena raised was the issue of the Africa integration, intra-Africa integration through the continental free trade area, and what are the opportunities presented for the continent. In this context, I think that the degree of its impact will depend on the alleviation of infrastructural and institutional barriers. So to maximize this impact, or to maximize the positive impact of Africa integration, there are some areas that we could look at more closely, both in terms of research and also policy debate. The first is, as already the panelists mentioned, attracting investment in hard and soft infrastructure. Because of time, I will not go into all of the points, but this is the first one. The second is the igniting the investment protocol of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is currently being negotiated. This will provide ample opportunities, and a swift adoption of the protocol and implementation of the protocol will prove to provide massive dividends in increasing foreign direct investment and to promote intracontinental investment. And finally, promoting cross-border investment initiatives such as regional transportation corridors, transnational special economic zones, and common digital networks can also play a key role in addressing the issue of tangible and non-tangible trade and investment barriers in the continent. So in terms of Elena's presentation, these are important issues that complement what already was discussed. Then how to bring these two presentations together and what issues for future research. First is what type of investment, industrial and trade policy we need in the post-pandemic, in the sustainable recovery context. The last presentation mentioned the importance of policy area and coherence, and I think this is an important debate, the complementarity between the three. The second issue is the issue of cross-border policy spillovers, and that goes back hand in hand to the issue of what are the dynamic gains that we could expect in the future from global sourcing. And this relates to all the work that on inclusion and development beyond employment that Kunal and the research team at UN-Wider have been doing. So with all this in mind, there are areas that need further attention, and I'm glad that Kunal mentioned the issue of gender as one of the key cross-border heterogeneous impact. We just launched recently a report showing that beyond the direct impact of foreign direct investment, there are the indirect spillovers transmitting from foreign affiliates to the host country, including through supply chain relationship, as the case of Bangladesh shows, also through competition and demonstration effects, through technology and labor mobility and so on. So the issue of gender equality should be an important part of the agenda, and not only what Kunal mentioned, but also Lorraine Eden has done also important work in terms of the business and international business literature and the Sustainable Development Goal and gender issues. Then the second issue is the Africa integration, which I will not go back to, but also as the case of Africa shows, the importance of promoting investment in sustainable development sectors and on productive capacities for recovery. And finally, it's important to go back and look at demand side issues. We saw in Africa commodity booms, we saw in developing countries and the issues of external transfer, public spending, alongside the traditional demand effects of productivity. But the question is whether this path is ultimately sustainable in the long run. So to sum up, there are some dilemmas and some important policy issues. And at UNCTAD, we have tried to address this through a sustainable investment framework that try to address the different aspects of demand and supply and the persistent issues of inequality and the lack of productive resources for the Sustainable Development Goals. In this vein, we think that more work is needed on the role of investment policies for recovery and for sustainable development, including facilitation, promotion, and the overall regulatory environment for investment. This is another area where there could be a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration. I don't want to abuse my 5 minutes. I think I am already exhausting them, but basically, as a sum up, I would like to thank the panel and also to remind the importance that any strategy for investment in sustainable development should include a focus on facilitating investment in different economic and social sectors of the Sustainable Development Goals as we reach the deadline for the 2030 Development Agenda. Investing in productive capacity is crucial because that's what will determine the success in the post-pandemic recovery effort and the achievements of the SDGs. I will stop here and I'm happy to come back to the debate later on after the second discussion.
Thank you very much. So our second discussion is Maria Teresa Fleury. So the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. And I'll try to address Lorraine's paper and as well as Ram's presentation. They are very interesting and insightful papers and presentations. Lorraine's paper, and I'll start with her presentation, addressed 3 very relevant phenomena, and they are all highly affected by COVID-19 crisis, the digital transformation, GVCs, and SDGs. And it's really a very stimulating paper that brings not only the Janus face, the bright side and the dark side of those phenomena with, if I may say, a more optimist view. And it, it's very good to have a more optimist view, especially on this time. And my comments to Lorraine and Ram are based on projects that I'm currently involved in the context of Latin America. So Kunai mentioned several projects in Asia. Elena highlighted the Africa continent. I'll try to put Latin America in this debate. The first project is about digital transformation in EMNEs, especially in the Brazilian EMNEs, a group that represents, I think, the positive tale of the firms with high level of adoption of 4IR dimensions. And they all have invested in CSR projects at home and abroad. And as you know, Brazil is suffering a strong impact from the pandemic, and those firms, as well as other firms, have been championing for several relevant initiatives, and even turning plants into making ventilators and so on. Second project is about how GVCs are restructuring their GVCs in Latin America. And so far, we see that the local subsidiary have autonomy in regards to 4IR. However, we are witnessing changes in the subsidiary roles with different organizational functions being relocated to other countries and sites. A point that Lorraine raises in page 7, leading to a widening gap in technological skills, institutional voids in less developed economies. And so we are really worried about what will happen in regards, for instance, innovation that Ram mentioned. And a third project about CSR with Supervisee Larissa Pacheco, and about CSR and local subsidiaries of MNEs in LA. And we stress the importance of institutional lens for studying empirically this phenomena. Actually, the title of our paper is Institutional Work for the Good, ? So my comments, my questions to Lorraine, don't you have to bring institutions to the playfield of your argument? I'm not sure if we don't have institutions reinforcing the bright side of your Janus face, MNEs will adhere to SDGs easily. Change 1 and 2 in your conclusion. Unless it is intrinsically part of their DNA. For example, I have been working with Natura, Brazilian multinational in the cosmetic industry, and sustainability is part of the company's DNA since its very early start. And recently, Natura has acquired Body Shop and last year Avon. And it's part of their strategy to integrate the new companies in the main pillars of sustainability, etc. So coming to your conclusion about the 3 changes that must be made, and the third, building a new UN MNEs coalition, I agree, but I think that you have to enlarge your argument, bringing local institutions and other supranational institutions to this new scenario, or otherwise you are not going to push the multinationals enough. In regards to Ram's presentation, and I'm trying to be very brief, Ari, because I know that we are running out of time, which I really enjoyed, I would like to make some comments. First, your smiling curve. Another view asserts that big techs will have a rising protagonism in that transition. In our research about the Brazilian multinationals leading firm, they are really concerned that Apple or Google may become interested in intermediating between the producer and the final client. And, you know, we are really worried what will happen with those global value chains. And another issue that I would like to raise is about the context and the context of Latin America. As I mentioned before, I'm currently involved with Afonso in a project about GVCs in Brazil and Latin America. And there is a limited inception of the great majority of LA countries in the global value chain. LA firms and, they are integrated into regional value chains, but with few exceptions, they are integrated in global value chains. And their main concern is how to upgrade and integrate with other parts of the world. And, our concern, how are they going to integrate in this innovation system that you mentioned? So I think that you have to contextualize your arguments in regards to developed countries versus developing countries and even emerging markets. And finally, coming to your stage 3 and the new normal. I agree with in regards to greater competitive pressure in both online and B&M firms. However, and I think that you have a very good argument, but I think that you have to qualify your argument again, developed versus developing countries. And the same for policies lessons. See, for instance, objective 3, preserve individual liberties. We are really worried what's happening around the world, and it's happening in Latin America. But I want to congratulate the 4 of you, for brilliant presentations, and it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar today. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to congratulate the discussants with the great comments you've given. So we're running out of time. We have about 8 minutes left for the discussion. So at the same time, there are 16 questions in the question and answer period. So what I want to do is I want to give 2 questions and ask them to 2 people. And please try to be very accurate in your response, but also concise. So the first question is related to a number of comments being raised in the question and answer box, which is that we've seen a downgrading of international cooperation in the last couple of years. We've seen a rise in populism. Now we're seeing increasing vaccine nationalism, etc. So a question that I have for Kunal is what this implies for the ability of developing countries to recover from the pandemic. And then I'm going to switch towards Lorraine as well and ask what that implies for your suggestion that AIB and UNCTAD should collaborate together, perhaps with multinational firms, to try to change the way how they harness digitalization. So I'll start with this and I'll come back with the other question after. Kunal.
So thanks very much, Ari, for the question. I'm going to be very brief in my answer. First, let's just understand. I mean, I completely understand where we're coming from on vaccine nationalism, populism. But if you look at what is going on right now in the EU around vaccines, the biggest protection that we have is the fact that we have an interdependent world, because the EU understand that if they were to bring in export bans, then that will disrupt value chains around vaccines, and that will be extremely costly. So counterintuitively, actually, the best protection we have right now is we are living in a world which is heavily globalized. And that is the best protection we have against nationalism. So first point. Second point is that for developing countries, the wrong lesson to take from the pandemic would be that we need to go back to old industrial policy. What is old industrial policy? Which is exactly as Lorraine mentioned, bricks and mortar type industrial policy. What would that mean in Africa, for example? Special economic zones, as we have seen in Ethiopia, for example. Those kind of industrial policies will not work in the new world that we have coming in front of us. The new industrial policy has to be around the fourth industrial revolution, has to be smart, has to be targeted, has to be based on intelligent subsidies to particular firms, which are the new firms to bring in the technology. So the old industrial policy, what might be the first response in many countries, especially in Africa and Asia, is not the right way to go proceed. We got to be much more smarter than that. So I hope the lesson that we take from this, what's going on in the world, should not be that we return back to what we used to do before, which was extremely damaging, as we know. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine.
I several questions in the chat dealing with this, and just very quickly, I too worry about nationalism and the rise of protectionism and the way things could turn for the worse over the next 10 years. On the other hand, I see a tremendous window of opportunity because of Industry 4.0 to make a move on the SDGs. And frankly, if we can make a move on the SDGs, that's a win-win, right? If we can use this opportunity to have some impact on the poorest and the weakest among us and make the world a better place, do something about the environment, I think it's important to do, and we have the window. The money is going to be spent. Firms are going to do it. The question is, how do we induce them to do it? And I think UNCTAD is in the right place and has the right skills and background because it's focused on developing countries, and it brings developing countries to the table on a regular basis. What Nirja and I are proposing is that the CSR, the heads of CSR in the world's largest multinationals, start to get together on a regular basis with UNCTAD to talk about, let's move CSR out of the marketing departments and a sideline within firms to centralize them so that we can think about the wicked problems that are the 17 SDGs, which I do not think are going to be handled by 2030. Wicked problems don't go away. We just try to deal with them from time to time. So I think if we look at this as a possibility for a win-win, we don't look at this as the United States or China. We don't look at this as nationalization. We look at this as an opportunity to do something for the world as a whole to help the weakest among us. I think multinationals will buy in. You can get CEOs to buy in. I'm very impressed with UN Women and what they have done with the women's empowerment principles and having CEOs sign on. Evidence-based policy making and the way that the UN has been gathering evidence for SDG 5. I think that policy can be replicated for other targets by others. It does vary. It has to vary whether it's a Walmart doing it, for example, or it's a Haya doing it. And the industry matters, the technology matters. That's why I think partly this is what we're proposing is to get together to exchange ideas where firms that are competitors in the marketplace can agree to cooperate on things for a social good. So I think Maria Teresa said it right. I think both Nirja and I are optimists. We think there's a window. We think there's a role here where we can make a difference. And if you know anything about me, I personally believe we're put here to try and make a difference for the better on the world around us. And I hope that the proposal we're making in this little paper might have some resonance and make the world a little bit of a better place for our children and our grandchildren. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I also have a question for Helena and Ram, and it's about resiliency. So Helena, you talked about the fact that Africa is a bit more on the margin. So how has that influenced their African thinking about what needs to be done to ensure resiliency? And then to Ram, also to you, I want to ask the question how resiliency differs when we're thinking about the more people-based connections versus the goods-based connections. I think there's been a lot of focus on the goods-based connections and resiliency, but how does that look like when you look at digital trade, et cetera? So I'll leave it to you. Please be short in your answers.
Thank you, Ari. Rosaline made an interesting point in the comment that is Africa even a unit? And I think one of the things that Africa, all the countries have in common is the scars of fairly recent colonialism. And I think that those scars of colonialism really require a specific kind of response. And that I think the Africa Union's focus on human lives rather than economies is a very strategic one to make sure that the different countries in Africa aren't divided by the fact that you do have richer and poorer countries, because in all those countries you need human lives to be protected and nurtured, and that really is the common denominator. I think what is important is that we need activism. So resilience alone, I was quite sad, Ari, when you spoke and you said we're seeing the end of the tunnel with the vaccinations coming. I don't have any sense of optimism that vaccinations will happen this year in my world. I do think lessons can be learned about the fight for HIV drugs, where South Africa is the global epicenter of the HIV epidemic. 1 in 7 South Africans are HIV positive. And we fought the WTO to have patents protection because it was a matter of a medical emergency to have them lifted. India has started working on that. And I really do think that there has been tremendous resilience and discipline in Africa. I'm struck by how collectivist societies seem to not fight about stupid things like mask wearing and keeping a social distance, because there is a sense of the collective mattering. But in order to move forward, we really do need African countries to stand together and to be a common voice. So I think a regional voice, the strengthening of the regional voice, the foregrounding of a shared humanity rather than focusing on the distinctions between different countries, and then finally making sure that we are activists about access to these things, that in the end, if we don't eradicate or get COVID under control in Africa, we're going to get a new variant that's going to be resistant to the strains that have been vaccinated against in your part of the world. So we have to see that we're all interlinked.
Thank you. Ram? You're on mute, Ram. Ram, you're on mute. We almost made
Sorry
it.
about that. Yeah. Yeah, I think the key word you mentioned was resilience. And I think the performance of the global economy in the last year and a bit has given us a lot of, at least in the advanced part of the world, great grounds for optimism. I mean, in spite of this is perhaps one of the greatest disruptions we have seen in many, many decades. And yet we have seen our global economic system operating, responding. I mean, even if you take the tip of the spear, just the vaccine development, acceleration, cooperation across universities, firms, small firms, big firms, from Pfizer and AstraZeneca at one hand to Oxford University on the other, and small little companies like Biogen and so on. This has been definitely a success story. Now, obviously, has it been perfect? Have there been things that we could have done better? Obviously, there have. But I think one of the things that we are going to have to grasp is if we want to see a great future for our children, we're going to have to restore the engine, innovation engine, as soon as possible. The hockey stick of innovation development that we have seen, I firmly believe, is because we have in the last 2 or 3 decades harnessed hundreds of millions of new brains into the global innovation system through connectivity. And if we don't reconnect those people, if we don't reach beyond our local connections, that we were back in the 1950s and 1960s, where everything was around 20 miles from your house, we, I think, are going to see a catastrophic decline in the pace of innovation progress. and this is going to hurt the poorest most of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So time has really flown. So we've had our 4 panelists, 2 discussants, a lot of food for thought. We see this as just the beginning of a discussion about investing into sustainable recovery. And so we hope to certainly see many more of these events in the future. Of course, if you have any questions for specific panelists or discussants, please feel free to email them. This is one of the beauties of the modern time, that we can very quickly connect to people digitally. We should be doing it more because we don't have as many opportunities of doing it in person. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Jan and Professor Jeremy Clegg, who will be providing the concluding remarks. James has been the director of the Investment and Enterprise Division at UNCTAD since 2009, and he leads the preparation of the World Investment Report. He then again is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and International Business Management at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. He's also an area editor of the Journal of International Business Policy, and most importantly, the president of the Academy of International Business. James, let me yield to you, and then Jeremy, you can take over afterwards.
Thank you very much, Ari. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wish to express our gratitude on behalf of UNCTAD to your participation, to the panelists who have this fantastic presentation and discussion, and also to Ari, not only for the excellent moderation of this session, but he's one of the 2 drivers behind the scene and even leading the process of the preparation of this event, together with my colleague Amelia dos Santos Paulino. And also my thanks going to Jeremy, who is the president of AIB, always pushing me very hard, seeing that this collaboration and coalition in advancing investment for sustainable development through research and policy analysis. And of course, also Tanga, who has been always behind the scene, trying to be modest, but always effective in driving the process forward and secure the logistic support, including technical support for hosting this event. And we're really grateful for AIB of this fantastic collaboration. So before I move on to the way forward, I see the collaboration between AIB and UNCTAD. I wish just try to mention a few very interesting ideas that I see it and would like to take it forward in UNCTAD future research and policy analysis, and even factor into our policy recommendations at different global forums, including the UN General Assembly, that we are the focal point for reporting annually according to the UN General Assembly resolution, the Finance for Development Summit, the G20 Trade and Investment Workstream that UNCTAD is coordinating on investment among the international organizations, including World Bank, IMF, OECD, WTO, and all these organizations. So what I'm saying is that there are very interesting ideas. We would like to look into it further ourselves among our colleagues, but also interacting with scholars here as the discussion panel of today, this afternoon and this morning. The ideas, for example, in the morning, Sarayana pointed out the effectiveness of incentives in renewable energy sectors for attracting investment, and also she mentioned the new initiative that is Energy Island in the North Sea. This kind of ideas that we can explore further, particularly as a recommendation to advanced countries and to the emerging economies, because they are in a position to build such a kind of energy island or renewable energy island. And this can also be a kind of regional approach for Africa and Latin America of poor countries, with the support of international development assistance. Just to use this example, And also, and Rob mentioned the future stress test for pandemic, the model of resilience. I would like to know more and for the team to study more on that. And also, how do we employ this kind of preventive model instead of curative model in addressing the key development challenges, particularly in achieving SDGs. I think this morning our commentator used the example of plastic pollution, and for that the multiple ways and means are needed. And if we go through a kind of problem, a case, and through that to address multiple SDGs, there'll be an interesting angle that we haven't thought about in our previous action plan for investing SDGs to the UN General Assembly. I think Jacob mentioned this morning of the 5 scenarios on the risks in project financing. That's another issue area that's worth further research and come up with policy recommendations for member states. I think Shasha mentioned the multi-faceted nature of the problems that I mentioned already, of that how we can address that. I think in the Q&As, there was an issue saying that are we trying to address the challenge that is to initiate a debate of post-Washington consensus, from a post-Washington consensus to post-COVID consensus. I see that's an interesting issue that raised in the morning session, not in the discussion, but in the Q&A. I guess it's extremely challenging in the current world, the current context, that the cold economic war is coming. Well, to build consensus, it will be extremely challenging in that respect. But there is a need for global collaboration, particularly taking advantage of the global endeavor on sustainable development through achievement of sustainable development goals. I see that in the afternoon session, we just had it, so I don't have to elaborate. I think I'm really grateful to Kuna Shin and Alina Bernard for raising the issues, the life and the livelihood of developing countries, the challenges, and for that, in particular, the implications of reshoring for the industrialization of low and middle income countries. This premature industrialization is a big challenge, and also single out the issue of productive capacity in essential medical products. And that's the issue we are going to address in the World Investment Report, together with the issue of renewable energy and infrastructure. And these are the aspects or the case studies we're going to look into under the overall kind of a theme of invest in sustainable and inclusive recovery. And also Lorraine's presentation extremely useful, because she's trying to provide solutions, and solution-oriented kind of approach is extremely useful. A number of things we are going to follow up, not only in our research and policy analysis, but also in action. For example, the M&E and the IO's coalition in pursuing SDGs. I think Ram's presentation extremely fascinating. It is eye-opening for me, and I think there's a number of issues we need to look into in the research, particularly this online and offline integration of GBCs, and also the new normal paradox. And how do we address these issues, not only at firm level, but also at a policy level to facilitate? I think there are also some questions which are very interesting. One idea is the observatories in FDI and the trade data, and particularly within the framework of SDGs for impact. Certainly, I look into this options to formulate a partnership, and this is Ricardo's suggestion. I think, and there are also many others. I think time is running up. Let me just try to highlight the AIB-UNCTAD collaboration. I see it. I would say that there are two tracks: approach, research, and the policy dialogue. Research that in the context of World Investment Report, for example, this year, the theme of the World Investment Report is, as I said, on investing in sustainable and inclusive recovery. And today's seminar has shed a lot of light for us, enlightening us in our further research and analysis to finalize our World Investment Report. We are going to, we're considering kind of special issue of the TNC journal, and to have a dedicated section in the forthcoming issue that will deal with the topic of the World Investment Report. And I wish to encourage colleagues and participants here to contribute to that process. Richard and Amelia are going to issue a kind of call for paper and manage the process. We'll continue for this year the award for young professionals and also PhD candidates to submit papers on investment development. We encourage policy-oriented analysis and a multidisciplinary approach, and we have kind of three types of benefits to offer. One is a consultancy contract to work with us for 3 months. The second is that to offer the TNC journal for publication. And the third, of course, is like others to present award. And this is a joint kind of initiative with AIB and Jeremy and I that we did last year, and will continue this year. And a call for candidates will be issued this week. And in terms of dialogue, policy dialogue, we'll continue the process like today, and we're going to participate in AIB conference. We'll organize a session on World Investment Report at AIB conference, and maybe we consider another topic to organize the session. At our World Investment Forum, which will be held in a kind of hybrid format, meaning virtual plus physical, in person. It will be in Abu Dhabi in October 17 to 24. And there will be an academic track. And that academic track will consist of kickoff, high-level, multidisciplinary seminar, followed by a kind of series of dialogue between academia and other multi-stakeholders. In fact, for that, we'll invite scholars to dialogue with policymakers, practitioners, civil society, and international organization representatives. So that will be very attractive, I guess, to the scholars. And these are the two tracks, and I'm sure that Jeremy has many more ideas to offer. I should stop here. I've talked too long. Thank you for your patience. And thank you very much to all for your participation, for your support to the collaboration between UNCTAD and the AIB. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Thank you. Well, I better be very brief indeed, because time, I'm afraid, has really run out. I'd like to thank those who haven't been thanked yet, the participants and attendees around the world, Asia Pacific and Oceania, who were with us this morning's session, and a belated welcome to you in the Americas who joined this afternoon, and to you in Europe, thank you for staying with us. From our morning session, James has picked out some of the high points that he sees. I learned something there. The meaning of resilience and sustainability varies according to different audiences, and that means we need to be more diverse in our thinking, and the best way of being more diverse in our thinking is to be more diverse in the people that we have in our forums, such as these. And today has been an exemplary example of doing precisely that. A particularly strong theme to emerge from this morning and this afternoon is the toxic effect of inequality between people within countries and its terrible effects upon economic growth and the ability of countries to improve social welfare. So it actually holds back development. The reduction of economic and social inequality is contained within the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's not yet become mainstream. And it's not become mainstream enough within firms, and I might add within the academic community, despite progress at the leading edge in advanced economies and in key areas such as energy transitions and taking advantage of digital technologies and digitization. But again, it's unequal in where we find it in the world and between people. Inequality has become the scourge of our world, both within and between countries, causing civil and political unrest, pushing up the cost of project financing, as we learned this morning, in precisely those economies which need investment the most, sustainable investment. And it's pushed also inclusion further away in all its aspects. What's clear is that we're going to need policies, including the international business policies that we need. We need to anticipate with those policies and head off the resumption of the track that the world was on before the pandemic. Now, looking forward to the World Investment Forum, as James has just said, it's scheduled for October this year. AIB will be partnering with UNCTAD for this major event, and the shape of our AIB contribution to that forum is currently being worked out, but it will be ambitious. Rob Gross, our past president of AIB, and Ari Van Ash, the deputy editor, as we know, of our Journal of International Business Policy, are leading in helping AIB to define our AIB-UNCTAD partnership of the future, starting with the World Investment Forum, as James has mentioned. At the forum, my successor as AIB President-elect Farrokh Contractor will take our AIB-UNCTAD agenda forward. We can, with our shared interest groups, and particularly our sustainability shared interest group, speak of AIB truly leading in the intellectual and policy challenges that come out of these two sessions today. More than ever before, AIB is greater than the sum of its parts, and its parts are its members. So AIB is pulling us all together and hopefully making our contribution more telling, and it needs to be telling in order to help the world and move us forward according to the agenda we've heard today. I encourage all of you attending these webinars to participate as a member within AIB, to join the Sustainability Shared Interest Group, and to help us define how our contribution within our subject field can build a partnership with UNCTAD. Please be, all of you, part of that partnership. Now, I encourage you to come to AIB 2021. That's our annual conference online. That's what we call our annual meeting, which runs from June 28th to July the 2nd. You can join the conference and pre-conference events. And if you're new to AIB, there'll be a great number of opportunities for you throughout. And the shared interest groups, and of course sustainability as well, will be dedicated to leading our research and your participation in it towards a bright future. Details can be found on the website www.aib.world. In being a member of AIB, you have a direct route to contributing to this AIB-UNCTAD agenda, and there's no reason why you cannot aim to work with UNCTAD. AIB is your channel to the world's most admirable and prestigious organizations, and surely UNCTAD is right at the top of those. So I want to again close in thanking Amelia and Ari in particular, and also AIB's Executive Director, Dr. Tunga Kiak, for his flawless technical support. And let me close by saying that I look forward to seeing you at AIB 2021, and with Rob Gross and Ari, and with James and his entire team at the World Investment Forum in October. Goodbye, but only goodbye for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.